So welcome to this very short session. These sessions are only 20 minutes, so I'm going to talk really fast. Basically, the topic today is speeding up relational data migration. How many people know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about speeding up data migration? And you're probably using data loaders to do it and some really difficult nights and days. My name is David Belove. I am the CEO of Prodly. We are the developers of Moover. Moover is a relational data migration app for the Salesforce platform. And I'm your host today. I've invited two speakers to address this topic. One is Mike Ackerman, who is a senior architect at Coastal Cloud, which is a platinum Salesforce implementation partner. And then I've also invited my colleague Dan Rudman, who is the founder of Prodly and our CTO. And he's going to give you a quick demo of our new CPQ templates that help to speed up the data migration process for relational data. So Mike is going to talk to us first about his process that he's developed for doing data migration at Coastal Cloud for CPQ and billing implementations. So before I hand it over to Mike, I just want to point out that the common denominator between these two speakers is this product called Moover. It is a Salesforce native relational data migration app, and it allows you to move data between production and sandboxes or sandboxes and production. So there are two basic use cases for this. One is moving transaction data from production into a sandbox, and you might do that for testing new code, and maybe you want to set up a sandbox for each of your developers and seed those sandboxes with test data. And then the other is essentially what Mike is going to talk about, which is moving reference data for a complex application like CPQ or Field Service Lightning or billing or ServiceMax or whatever it is from a staging sandbox into production. And this is really important because with something like CPQ, we're talking about 45 objects in the product catalog. So it's a very complex thing. So let me just introduce Mike a little more in a little more depth. So as I said, he's the senior architect at Coastal Cloud, and he is a Salesforce CPQ and billing expert. They have done numerous implementations over the last several years, in fact, going back to the Steelbrick days. And Mike's unique capability, expertise, is that he's very process-oriented. So he's spent a lot of time figuring out how to manage the process, both from a metadata and from a reference data perspective for doing implementations like CPQ. And of course, he's been using CPQ or Moover for the last year or so to do these migrations. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Mike, and he'll talk to you about his process.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Mike.
All right. So, like Dave said, I'm Mike Ackerman from Coastal Cloud, and so we have a lot of practices at Coastal Cloud. We do a lot of quote cache implementations for our customers, which includes both Salesforce CPQ and Salesforce billing. And specifically today, I'm going to talk about how we use Prodly Moover as part of our application lifecycle management process, or ALM, to help enable that. So, if any of you have done quote-to-cash projects, you know that it's a very powerful tool, and the power comes in its flexibility, that you can set up very complex product rules and features and options and pricing and discounting all through the configuration of reference data. The CPQ data model itself has 41 reference objects that are used for configuration, and on the billing side, they've got 16 reference objects. And this, when I say reference objects, this is the type of data that would typically be updated, inserted, deleted by a developer during the release lifecycle, and then delivered to production with the deployment, and you typically used as read-only in production. So at Coastal Cloud, we come to our clients with a methodology to make sure we deliver our projects with high quality and efficiently. And as part of our methodology, we have an ALM process. And my key message here is that when you're developing your ALM process, it's not just about moving your declarative and your programmatic changes through the metadata, but you also have to make sure that you're also treating reference data as a first-class citizen and considering how you're going to get the reference data deployed with your project. And as you work through the life cycle of your application, as you go from setup to feature development to testing and bug fixing to production deployment, even as you're doing production maintenance to support your production users, each of these steps involves delivering your application to another org or another environment. And so you want to make sure you've got the process in place to not only deliver the metadata changes, but also the reference data changes. And that's where Prodly Moover comes in. We like to recommend Prodly Moover as a great tool to migrate the reference data as part of our ALM process. So life before Prodly Moover. How did we do this before we discovered Moover? So take, for instance, an example where I'm in my setup phase and I want to set up 3 developer orgs so each of my developers can work in their own sandbox on the features. So I want to take a copy of the existing reference data that's in production and get them into my developer orgs. Well, before Moover, I would probably fire up Data Loader, export those 60 or so objects into Excel, and then I've got to meticulously go through each of those objects. First of all, identifying objects that have a recursive relationship in them, and load the parent-most rows of that object into the developer org, get the new keys and the new IDs that were assigned, rekey the child rows, and then copy the child rows into the developer org, and then repeat that until I've gotten all the way down to the child-most row. Then you also got to consider the parent objects and the child object relationships. Again, moving the parent objects first, getting the new keys, rekeying the child objects in the Excel spreadsheet, and then copying the child objects. And then if I want to do this for 3 dev orgs to set them up, I got to repeat that whole process 3 times. So as you can see, a very labor-intensive process, very prone to error, and in an agile environment that just is not scalable. So a tool like Prodly Moover really helps us to scale that process. So this is how we like to set up our environment topology using Prodly Moover. So the green box in the middle there is a Prodly managed package. We install it one time in our production org, and it kind of acts as a centralized console there. We can manage the movement of data between any of our orgs from that one place. So the first thing we'll do is we'll start by setting up our major release environments. So getting those 3 feature development orgs set up by taking Prodly Moover and copying the reference data from production into each of those feature orgs. Then we'll designate one of those feature orgs as the org where the development or the configuration will go on as part of the major release, and the developer will make the configuration changes in the reference data, and very continuously pushing that reference data into the other developer orgs. So the developers that are doing their programmatic and declarative changes are always testing and developing on current data that's going to be more like what's going to production. Then once we're ready to enter into the testing phases, we'll use Prodly to copy the latest version of the reference data from that feature org into testing, do our testing and bug fixing, and then once it's time for deployment, again, use Prodly, single click of the button to get the data from our integration test environment into production. Now at the same time, we've probably got production users that may be experiencing issues in the everyday use of the production org. So we've got a maintenance team that we also need to support. So we set up for them a prod fix-it environment where they can do more iterative, at a higher cadence maintenance releases to fix issues that are currently ongoing in production. So at the same time, we're using Prodly to get a copy of the reference data from production into their prod fix environment. They quickly do their changes and do a delivery back into production. And they use Prodly for that, as well as using Prodly to deliver that latest production copy to all of our developer and testing orgs for the major release. So that way, we're moving data frequently, we're keeping all these environments up to date, and everybody's testing and developing on the most current version of data. So a little bit under the hood of that green box that is Prodly Moover, we have a Prodly Moover installed in what we call a control org, and the first thing we do is we configure a data set. And the data set is basically tells us about the structure of the data we want to copy, the relationships it has, and how they want that copy to take place. That data set is then used by the Moover service on Heroku to get the data from the source org and then copy it to one or many feature development orgs, destination orgs. Now the nice thing that happened with the latest release of Prodly as of September is those data sets are now can be saved as templates and exported and stored in an external repository like GitHub or Google Drive or something, and then reused in other implementations. So they can be imported, so you don't have to constantly be redefining those data sets. They can easily be shared, which is very nice. Saves us a lot of time. So just a couple of tips for success when you're thinking about application lifecycle management and including reference data in that process. Number one, get yourself set up early. Train your stakeholders on the process, know what tools you're going to use, and identify the objects that you're going to consider reference data that are going to be deployed with the application. As you identify each of those reference data objects, you want to identify a surrogate key, so an external unique identifier on each of the rows. And you want to use a surrogate key as opposed to a natural key, because a surrogate key has no business value. And once you assign that key to the row, you can be pretty well guaranteed it's going to keep that value for the lifetime of that row. And that's important because we need to use that external ID to identify when we copy the data to another org to know whether it's going to be an insert, update, or delete. So a very important step there. You want to establish that early. Take advantage of the reuse of data sets. Configure it once, get yourself a baseline, take an extract of it into GitHub, and then use it again rather than not reinventing the wheel all the time. Number 4, synchronize your environments frequently. So this is continuous integration, and Prodly helps enable that. So keep your dev and your QA environments up to date. When you do a production fix-it push, keep the latest version of production up to date in your dev environment so that you're working from the latest version of the data. Come up with a good deployment checklist. Make sure you've got all your steps down in place for the day it comes to go live and deploy to production. Obviously, making reference data a key piece of that deployment checklist, and practice it in a staging environment before you actually go to production. Make sure you've worked out all the kinks. And finally, if you're a systems integrator like us, you're probably moving on to another project at some point, so you want to make sure your ALM process is well documented and you train your successors, or if you're moving on to another role, make sure you train the successor of whoever's going to be continuing to manage this process so that it's repeatable and continues to be successful. So with that, it's a broad brushstroke in a short amount of time, so I'm happy to answer questions afterward, but I'm going to hand it over to Daniel Rudman, who's going to give you a little demo. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. So I'm going to get into the demo, but before we do that, I just wanted to quickly give you a sense of the amazing work that we've been doing at Moover for the last few months, making these CPQ deployments even easier and even quicker and more reliable with these CPQ templates that we've been putting together. So, we spent a lot of time polishing and refining these and working with experts in the field to make them available for the CPQ community, so you hit the ground running. So these templates will make your CPQ reference data migration much more scalable, because you can size it up to a team and even non-technical people can kick them off. It's much more reliable because we've gone through and make sure that all of the objects, all of the required relationships are included, and that all the external IDs are defined to make sure that the upsert, as Mike mentioned, which is critically important, works. And you have a repeatable process, because with these templates, you're not starting from scratch. You have a predefined format, and everyone is on the same page. So strongly encourage you to use these new templates, and as mentioned, they're publicly available on our website or on GitHub. You can take them, you can extend them, you can customize them for your need, but you're going to be starting about 80%, 70% of the way there, not starting from scratch. And we also have a very detailed user guide, which will help guide you through how to use those templates, how to import it, and go through a lot of the caveats of the CPQ deployment. So it's extremely useful as well. So part of the work that we did was to validate these templates with sample CPQ data from high-tech demo org from Salesforce. So this is actual data that Salesforce uses to perform deployments and perform demos for their customers. So it's a wide variety of data, and encompasses all the objects that are included in CPQ. So we put our templates and we ran it with that to make sure that everything works. We ran it repeatedly, and that gave us a good sense, and give you a good sense of what's possible with Moover and these templates. We've also spent a lot of time reviewing the templates and the approach in general with a variety of CPQ experts. So like Mike, other people like Gio Mize, who was one of the founding members of Steelbrick, and then founder of Steelbrick as well, which turned into Salesforce CPQ. So there's been a lot of input and a lot of refining from people who really know in the fields. Sure. And so lastly, please use the templates. Check them out. It'll save you a lot of time. And also, we're going to introduce what we're calling a virtual external ID in Moover, and that will make deployments even easier. With that feature, you're not going to have to track the external IDs themselves. We'll track them for you, and we'll keep a record of all the objects that get deployed. So that'll take even more pain and make things even faster. All right, so let me hop into the demo now. All right. So I have an org here where Moover is installed, and I already have a lot of these templates imported. So you can see here, there's currently 16 templates. It's broken up by various feature areas of CPQ. So it goes from very simple things like a custom action or custom script, which is really just one object, to very large data sets, like a product data set, which might include 30, 40, 50 objects, and maybe 100 relationships. So that's really where the power of Moover comes in, right? To move all this complex data. And these templates give you a big starting point. So if you were to author this from scratch, for example, if we open the product data set, you can get a sense for just how complex it is. So this are all the parent-child relationships. And if you go into these other objects, you have multiple relationships as well going down and around. Yeah. So to author this from scratch would take considerable effort. So with these templates, you're really getting a big, big head start. Just to give you an idea of how it works, so I'll import one template here. So let's take in a quote template. Here we go. So if you're familiar with CPQ, this is a much more simpler area. So you have about 4 objects. And if we go here, there is a data set now created. And that template file is just a JSON file, basically. So it's a JSON representation of all this data set that we have configured. So here's the data set that just got created. You can see it's for the quote template object. We're using upsert here. We have the configuration to create fields automatically and sync picklist field values. And the external IDs have already been pre-selected for you. So in this case, it's very simple. It's just one field. But for other data sets like products, it could be multiple fields and even parent lookups. All right. And then we can see the parent relationships. So here we have the content included. This is a template content record. And we have columns and sections included. And if you hop into those are related to other objects as well. So we can pretty much deploy it as is. So I'll go ahead and click the deploy button. You can select which org you want it to go from and to. In this case, I'm just going to go from this production org to a sandbox. So I'll kick it off. And we'll get a deployment started. You can see here, Moover provides you a dynamic results page where you can see the status. You can also stop and pause deployments, and you get a progress bar. Shows you how far you've gone. And eventually, you'll get results. Here, I can show you the one from before. You get results at the batch level and also at the individual record level. And if there was any errors, you would see those here as well. and you get links to both the source and the target record for easy auditing. All right, that's it. Thank you.
So thank you very much for attending this session. Dan, Mike, and I will stay around if you want to ask questions. Otherwise, Mike Ackerman and the Coastal Cloud folks have a booth in the .org section at the Westin Hotel, and we have a kiosk that's right behind us. But we'll stick around if you want to ask questions. Thank you very much.